Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Real United States. I'm your host Paul Campbell, and behind the camera as always is my camera operator and wife Beverly Campbell. Welcome to Fort Michilimackinac. Fort Michilimackinac was built in 1715 by French soldiers. It stayed under French control until the British overthrew this area, and it fell under British control in 1761. Later, fearing an attack by American rebels, the British moved their fort from this facility across the Straits of Mackinac to Mackinac Island and the fort that stands over there. We're here on the Straits of Mackinac, just on the edge of Mackinac City, the top of the lower peninsula of Michigan. And we wanted to share with you this very historic site that played a big role in the fur trade, which was an incredibly important part of commerce here in the colonial days of the United States. So join us for Fort Michilimackinac. Let's see what we have inside. How you doing, sir?
Not too bad. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
I saw you were admiring my birch bark canoe here, though.
It's gorgeous.
Well, it's partially gorgeous because this is actually crafted from what's called the birch bark of the 21st century. This is a fiberglass vessel. But we do have, right over here,
You know what? I am an idiot. This was so well done. This was so well done that it looks like the real McCoy.
we get a lot of people thinking
You know
it.
that? And you've
Hi there,
actually gone to
folks.
the trouble of making this, so I am an idiot, but that's not a surprise to any of y'all.
Yeah, we actually have a piece of authentic birch bark right here, though. So this would be a segment of the canoe. So essentially what it is layers of birch bark on there, and the natural fiber that's tying it, that's actually spruce root right there. Spruce root and then pine pitch over top, which is basically just the sap from the pine tree, and then it's tempered with bear grease or charcoal, something like that. And inside there's actually ribbing, so you're not sitting on pure birch bark the
Right.
whole time. So you have those as your main support. And I kind of caught a little bit of that. You are right, these would be very lightweight vessels, but certainly kind of vessels that can carry a lot. If you look at the bales I have here, this represents about one canoe's worth of cargo, about 2,000 to 3,000 pounds. Is one one of these could carry. This 27-foot long, what they call the canoe de Nord,
Right?
all of these canoes, they were designed before Europeans arrived by Native Americans. So this is
Right.
essentially native design that's adapted for use not only in transportation but also cargo carriage. Now between Montreal and Michilimackinac, they actually used Montreal canoes. We actually saw in our visitor center, we had one hanging up, about a 40-foot long canoe that would be used to carry about 6,000 to 8,000 pounds of cargo. Certainly need a big crew for that, though. About 10 to 12 men would be crewing a vessel of that sort. And actually, the journey between Montreal and Michilimackinac was kind of thought of as the easier leg in this fur trade journey. You have about 1,000 miles, which is made in about a month. So there are also 36 portage points along that journey. So what would you have to do? You'd have these bales that weigh about 90 pounds each. Using tump line, you take a minimum of 2 of them, set them right about here on your head, and usually you're going to be running with these, or at least keeping up a light jog for about 800 to 900 yards.
Right.
That would be one pose in the journey before you took a break again. And these portages could last any amount of time. The longest I'm aware of is out in Minnesota. They have what's called Grand Portage, 9 miles you'd have to travel. But this one is more indicative of traversing the interior of the nation. So
Right.
heading out from this site, you would be going to places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, maybe even as far as the Dakotas by the 1770s.
Okay, folks, we're actually going to enter the fort now here, just off the Straits of Mackinac. We're going to enter Fort Michilimackinac, and you can see what a beautiful job they've done with this, and what a massive structure this is. I mean, these are literally whole trees. Well, almost whole trees. Half trees have been cut. Just a gorgeous example of an 18th century fort. Very much what you'd expect from the interior of a fort. Certainly from any movies that you've seen that have been made in the United States. Now go ahead and pan around here, and you can see that they have a catwalk built around that soldiers can stand on to defend the structure and the residents inside. Large courtyard in here. And that catwalk goes all the way around. This is really, really quite nicely done, and very much what you'd expect, again, if you've seen any of these forts in old movies or television shows. Interesting thing here, very close to the wall, and I don't know if this would have been done in the period, but certainly they would have had some sort of garden inside, where a few consumables would have been grown, perhaps herbs. So this particular case, they've done this as raised bed gardening. I don't know if that would have been necessarily done in the day, although it might have been. But certainly there would have been some sort of small garden inside for growing a few things. And then behind us, right inside the door, we have a storehouse. Because you got to realize that a fort housed people and supplies and things for the encampment. So there would have been storehouses separate from their munitions room where they kept, you know, powder and bullets or whatever. So flour, grains, vegetables, all sorts of things would have been stored in these buildings inside of the fort. And of course, water and wine. And all the commodities. Now, hopefully the light's going to adjust in the iris of the camera, but you can see here the barrels behind us. In this case, not wine, but rum. A very, very popular commodity. Salt pork, salted meats, very, very important part of the staples of that era because there was no refrigeration or much canning. A lot of meats were salted. Like I said, flour, there's vessels, cooking vessels stored here, all sorts of household equipment, tools and whatnot that would have been kept in the storehouse. Now in this particular one, if we can get a shot of it, there is a root cellar. It has a stone floor. And a root cellar would have been used for storing vegetables like potatoes, carrots, maybe onions, a lot of root crops, things that can be stored just by basically caking them in earth in the root cellar, and they will keep in their natural state. Huge beams hewn out of trees here for building the structure. Just really nice example of the sort of early American colonial era architecture. Very simple, very rustic. And you can actually see in the walls here on these that these were hewn out of logs with a wide pick-like affair called an adze, where they would have hewn these out to shape them up into square timbers to be stacked and fastened together to build the walls. These are solid wood walls, and I mean just a solid chunk of tree. Very, very nice. A lot of work, very labor intensive, but there wasn't much technology. Certainly in the very early colonial days, even if the technology existed, there were no sawmills here, so everything had to be done by hand with hand tools. Now another one of the building techniques that I just happened to notice, in this building over here where you would have timbers that run vertically instead of horizontally. And then they would actually mortar stones in between. So this is sort of a combination of timber and masonry, but instead of building an entirely stone structure, they were partially masonry. And a lot of times it was just field stone. It wouldn't have been cut stone because it was readily available in this part of the world. The lake right here, these large round stones, very easy to just pick up and carry here, and adverse to dragging a whole tree in. So if they had access to cement for making mortar, then they would have used this sort of thing. Now this would have been a quarters with a cooking facility, it looks like. There's a large fireplace in here. Oh, I see. Actually, commanding officer's house. The commanding officer of the fort would have lived here near the gate. Something you wouldn't expect, certainly in modern times, is a wood beam right next to a fireplace. But interestingly enough, a large solid chunk of wood like that is not subject to really catch fire easily. Flagstone and then ledgestone. And you can see by comparing this, with me as a reference, that this is a very large fireplace that's probably nearly 4 feet tall, the opening, and something on the order of about 5.5 or 6 feet wide. And there's actually 2 of them in this room. The outside of the structure is probably very nearly 8 feet by 8 feet, with the chimney going up through these hewn beams. And you can imagine that these massive fireplaces are really a necessity because of the fact that we are at about, 47 degrees north latitude, right on the water near the Straits of Mackinac. Extremely cold weather here in the winter. Certainly in the double digits below 0 Fahrenheit. Even where we live, some 4 hours south of here, it was 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. So obviously, in that era, having these massive fireplaces was something of a necessity. But I just love this colonial American architecture. And there's probably very similar sort of architecture in other parts of the world from that era and prior to that era. I'm not sure how well the camera will pick this up. If you look at this glass, it's kind of wavy. And this glass is very, very old. You can pick that up?
Yeah, I'm picking up some of it.
Okay. This glass is very old. This may well be glass from the era in the 1700s when this fort was built. And it's wavy. It's called pressed glass because of the way it was manufactured. It may well have been manufactured here in the United States. There is a glass refinery, if you will, or manufacturer in Williamsburg, Virginia, or in Yorktown, where they make glass from native sand. Interestingly enough, this piece of glass, it's not obvious from this picture, but this glass, there's these ribs here. And this glass would actually be thicker at the bottom than it is at the top, because believe it or not, glass is a liquid. I know, that seems weird. It seems solid enough, but it's a non-crystalline structure. Opal and glass are non-crystalline. Very, very, very old pieces of glass actually will run down over 100 or 200 years and be ever so few thousandths of an inch thicker at the bottom than they are at the top. It's kind of a weird but interesting phenomenon. And welcome to the Church of St. Anne. This is the chapel that would have been here when the fort was built in the early 1700s. One of the necessities of life for these folks at the time would have been a church. We see it's a very simple structure, all wood, simple benches with no backs, but very, very neat, beautiful cathedral ceiling, even though it's just a wood timber structure, and nicely decorated in the fashion of the time. And this would have been a Catholic church. The settlers who came to this part of the country at the time, the Jesuits and others, were predominantly Catholic. So the church would be indicative of that style, including the baptismal, or the baptismal, but the confessional in the corner. And there is a small bronze bell in the steeple, which would have been operated from this rope hanging in the middle of the room here. Individual would simply take a pole with a hook on it, grab a hold of that ring, so it would be overhead and not away, but then they could pull on that to ring the bell up in the steeple above us. But you can see the massive amount of work that went into constructing this church. These are huge beams that have been these are actually sawn beams. So this church was probably constructed sometime later after the fort had been here for several decades. And the beams are in fact straight on the bottom and arched on the top. There's a bit of a concave structure to the roof. All mortise and tenon cross ties, big pegs to hold them together. This is quite an impressive feat of construction, given the technology of the day. But it's a lovely, lovely structure. Here, in fact, is along the window is the pole. Along the window is the pole that has a hook on it that you would use for grabbing that ring to ring the church bell. And they have a record of marriages, interments, burials, and baptisms. I'm not sure the camera can do this justice. This is really quite a impressive building. And here we've actually caught them cooking.
Hello, come
How you
on in.
doing?
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the invitation. This is very nice.
We are actually working on cooking our noonday meal. We are actually making spinach pudding, but we
Nice.
actually, instead of spinach, since our spinach isn't up, we're actually using radish, the greens off the radishes. So we just boiled the radishes in a pot, right on the hot coals.
All right.
Chopped them up really fine. We then made a base of cream, eggs, a little nutmeg, a little melted butter, and then just grated breadcrumbs.
Okay.
Now this is not like a typical pudding like we're going to do today. It's actually a boiled pudding. So what you're going to do is we're going to take our pudding cloth, we're going to dampen it a little bit, rub flour all over it, put the dough in the middle of it, fold up the edges, and then we'll put it in a pot of boiling water that's at a rolling boil. Puddings are very common. They're not a sweet pudding, but they are kind of like the jelly rolls we think of today. In fact, in the Victorian times, they'd call them cannonball puddings because they come out in a big like a big cannonball.
Yep.
Now the house that you're standing in is the merchant's house. Many of the
Right.
merchants are coming from out east, so a lot of them had access to a lot of lavish things and usually had a good income so they could afford the nice things like the fabric you see on the bed.
Certainly.
Now Michilimackinac was actually more of a meeting point for both parties. Merchants from the east, fur traders from the south and the west would come here, exchange their goods and head back to their respective homes. Initially, Geoffrey Amherst, who was in charge of the British military, he did want the natives to have to start bringing all their trade goods here to do their trade, but unfortunately that was one of the causative factors of Pontiac's rebellion, because that's really not the way they've been doing things. You know, it really kind of put a kink in the way they did live their life.
Right.
So very quickly Geoffrey Amherst started allowing people to go back out and do the trade with them in their own native land rather than having to bring their goods here. So
Interesting.
this is a typical size of a single family home. Many of our people would have lived here only seasonally.
Right.
Like the merchants would have lived here while they were doing their business, and then come late summer, they'd only spend about 3 to 4 weeks here, but it took them about a month and a half long journey to get
That's
here.
true.
They would head back to their prospective homes. They average about 10 families that we think probably lived here, but it's really hard to say because everybody kind of came and went and things like that.
And they lived inside the fort under the protection of, well, whoever happened to hold it at the time.
Correct. And the
French
reason
or the British.
the British were here, but the British quickly realized that the main reason that this fort was here was for the fur trade and not for military reasons.
Yeah.
So they very quickly, realized that, okay, if we kick the French out, where's the fur trade gonna go? Wherever the French goes. Because
Yeah.
the French have married into native families.
Sure.
They have built the trade relations. So they've got the trust that the British hasn't developed yet. So they want to keep that. So they allowed the French to stay here, allowed them to keep their homes and their businesses, and their religion, but they did have to swear allegiance to the king, which was King George III. One of the first people that did swear allegiance to the king was Father Pierre Dugenet. He was our last Jesuit priest here. But he felt it was his duty to do that, to kind of support his constituents here inside the fort, to let them know that even with this drastic change in their life, everything would be okay.
Oh, that's very cool. That's very cool. Boy, I wish we had smell-o-vision, folks, because there's just something so beautiful and romantic about the aromas here, the food, the fire, everything. This is really very nice. Now, yeah, pudding, actually, yeah, pudding is not like the creamy sort of things that many of us here in the United States think of today. Yeah, it's more akin to fruitcake, perhaps.
Potatoes.
Yeah.
A little more doughier than fruitcake.
A little
but very
doughier
similar.
than fruitcake, but yeah, figgy pudding kind of thing. It's a big boiled ball of dough, depending on the
much.
dish. Whether figgy dowdy or spotted dick or something like that is usually a relatively sweet dish, but not terribly sweet like fruitcake. So yeah, oh, I love pudding. It's just that 4.5 hours of boiling.
Exactly.
is a
It
bit
takes
much
a
for-
long time.
But yes, I have done that. And I do enjoy doing it.
Yeah. Our prep work would have started early in the morning.
Right.
When the sun came up, the lady of the house would have been preparing the dinner, getting things ready. Well, probably at this time of year, the man of the house would have been doing his business with whoever was in the fort walls or anything of that sort. So